Então às vezes a internet cai e eu tenho que apanhar. Então, assim eu não tenho que estar a olhar. Mas obrigada.
Tem que sair já já.
Antes vou viver por ouvir, tá bom?
Muito legal. Meu cabelo que não tá feliz desse calor.
Todos nós temos um brilho, que é o brilho da nossa alma, que sai por tudo. Eu estou aqui morrendo, já estou morrendo há 3 dias.
Pelo menos estamos todos no mesmo barco, literalmente.
Já estou há dias a morrer. Mas olha, a gente tem proteína, tem proteína CDR, a gente tem continuar. Você não estava cá ontem, mas a gente teve servidor americano a falar de CDR. Tivemos o governo da Austrália, o governo do Reino Unido, os Estados Unidos, o governo da Austrália anunciou o plano de CDR aqui no pavilhão. Está muito bom, temos continuado. Hoje o projeto estava cheio outra vez. Tem tudo muito, temos muitos jornalistas.
O assunto está chamando muita atenção.
Tá, e a minha filha da presidência, a Carol, ela passou por aqui, eu sou pavilhão, está super trabalhado. E, não, a gente está super bem. Isso é o que a gente
Você vai estar ocupando um espaço bem legal. A gente vai lançar o estudo que a gente fez no isso. O Nicolas participou.
Adorei, muito obrigada.
Bem legal. E aí a gente vai agora fazer a segunda fase do estudo, que é um aprofundamento.
Maravilha. Muito interessante.
Assim, a ideia é que realmente criar.
Tem que criar mais conteúdo. Então a gente convidou o Eduardo Baixo, escrevi no pavilhão ontem. E ele vai, foi muito bom. O Eduardo fala mais sobre o que faz, pode apresentar bem o Brasil nesse espaço.
Legal.
Já vai estar nos ouvindo todos no YouTube.
Já estamos ao vivo. Ah,
Já
tá.
estamos ao vivo.
A gente está conectado ao microfone.
Não, isso é só. Vai estar ouvindo muita gente falando.
E você?
Eu boto por aqui.
Falamos sim, participa um pouco, porque não é todos que têm a oportunidade.
Não, eu deixo o live do 2h30, assim,
Já se sabe
as pessoas estão preparadas para pensar.
que vai acontecer. Vocês estão com a Terra do Ótimo, que são concorrentes.
Mesma coisa.
Esse é o Félix.
É o Félix, depois a Mariane, depois o Mike, que é o Business Council.
Trabalho de formiguinha, né? É um trabalho de formiguinha, assim, que ele faz. Mas tá bom. Passou a ser relevante.
Pois é, já tem ordem de currículo. Eu acho que você tem que. Vou te mostrar uma coisa, só para te dar perspectiva sobre o que é CDR de alta vulnerabilidade. Quando a gente olha, a gente tem
this. It is great to have you all here today. Thank you for joining the session on carbon removal in Latin America, the CDR 30. Carbon removal is quickly transitioning from a startup to a scale-up phase globally, but today we want to focus on what carbon removal looks like in Latin America specifically, both for where we are today and because as part of the Carbon Business Council, we recently launched what is known as the Latin America Working Group. Out of curiosity, in the audience here today, who works with carbon removal in Latin America, either from a project development standpoint, investors, buyers, etc.? Ah, fabulous. I'd love to see it. And also, who works in carbon removal in the investor or development space globally? Amazing. Thank you for sharing your take. That is exactly the type of cross-collaboration that we'll need across both Latin America in the regional sense and then also in the global deployment sense. So it's awesome to see that mix of perspectives on the ground today. We have a great group of panelists in the room today that's going to talk about project development in Latin America. So we'll spend the bulk of the discussion hearing from them through a Q&A that we've prepared, but then we'll also leave a good chunk of time at the end in order to hear audience questions from you all in case you have things that you want to chat through with our lovely panelists. I'll be moderating the discussion. For those who I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Sasha Shabil. I'm the Communications Director at the Carbon Business Council. We are a coalition of over 100 different CDR companies working to scale carbon removal globally. And we work across the project developers, the suppliers, the investors, the market shares, the standard setters, kind of the whole gamut of carbon removal folks working to scale the industry. We recently launched what is known as the Latin America Working Group, which is what I mentioned earlier, and that's bringing all of those different stakeholders together in this region in order to set Latin America up as a continued leader in carbon removal. Although the Carbon Business Council works globally, today, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on this region specifically with the projects that are focused in Mexico, in Argentina, in Chile, and across the world. With that, I will kick it over to our panelists to start a wonderful conversation, spotlighting the implementation and the projects growing on the ground, as well as the investment and the global lens that's happening at CDR. So I will kick it over to our panelists for brief introductions to tell us what you do in the region briefly and what your expertise is here. Julia, I would love to start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Sasha, also for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia, co-founder and CFO at Teradot. We are a science and technology company that is using our technology to activate mining and agricultural assets for enhanced rock mining.
Hi everyone, I'm Caio Franco. I'm the head of policy for Mombac. Mombac is a Brazil-based company that works with CDR and whose first CDR strategy is reforestation projects. So we do large-scale biodiverse reforestation of the Amazon, and specifically the state in which we are in. We have 12 reforestation projects in the state of Panama.
All right, there we are. Hey everybody, my name is Mike Green. I'm the director of carbon markets at a company called Native, based in Burlington, Vermont. We're a project developer that's been around since about 2002, so we've been at this for a while. Over that time period, we have upwards of 60 million tons either delivered or in our pipeline ready to be delivered in the near future. My role at Native is I do project investment, project procurement. We have coined a project type where we call it help build, where our corporate partners put up the upfront catalytic capital into the projects, giving the project developer the money that they need upfront to launch their project and get it off the ground. Often though, our project partners, the corporations that are working with us, have additional needs beyond what they've invested in their projects, so I manage all of those other project investments. So I'll get to talk to you a little bit today about some of that work we're doing, as well as one of our favorite projects that will be going through its first issuance later this year. That is in Patagonia. Thank you.
So hello everyone, my name is Maria and I work at Future Prime and I'm responsible for the technical part of the project, especially the tech-based solutions.
I'm Felix, co-founder and CEO of Organic. We're scaling carbon removal and regenerative agriculture practices in Brazil. Because we think Brazil is the place to be. It's be great to see so many familiar faces. We had a really nice discussion, which can also go in more depth than usual. I'm really looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for the introductions. In terms of panelist Q&As, I will kick it over to Mike first, actually. I know you briefly mentioned that you're developing a project in Patagonia, which is focused on soil organic carbon project. And it's the first of the kind in its country, which is Argentina, and the largest in the region. I'm curious what motivated your team to look towards Argentina for this project, and what have been your learnings in implementing the project in the region?
So it's actually a little bit of a soil carbon nerd answer to the question, in that what we found out is that in semi-arid desertification areas, we've been able to really see the most benefit from soil organic carbon. So our first project was actually in the US, focused on Montana. And then we quickly launched a project and were able to get involved in a project in Kenya, which is the largest SOC project on the planet. And we started looking for other regions, and it's not just the ecological side that makes it really important when we pick a region and pick partners. It was also the community that came to us. We saw a real demand and real need for that upfront catalytic capital that I was talking about at the beginning. That money went into providing the infrastructure for the regenerative grazing projects. We're really fortunate enough to work with Eileen Fisher and a few other companies that actually are using or need that wool as a part of their supply shed, right? So we're able to not only just be finding the right corporate partners that are looking for the carbon and being able to provide that catalytic capital into a new project type, but also that it touches their business, right? It's something that they can help make the case that we're not just doing all we can in-house, but we're really looking to shift the market. So we look for those ingredients to come together to pick our location. In the project in Argentina, if I can just say a little bit about the progress that it's had, we recently had the photos come back from the ecological study and kind of management work that's going on. And what the piece that really spoke out to me the most is there's this absolutely lovely looking Patagonian fox that lives in the area. And we're starting to see them expand their region, which is a great sign, because what that means is the ecological restoration that's happening in the area because of the regenerative grazing practices and the ranches that we're working with. We're really starting to see, even at the top of the food chain, things start to shift. That means nature's really healing itself. We had over 100 years of basically paddock grazing where they're beating down the grasslands. With that, they're destroying the diversity and the things that made that place special. And so the fact that we can start to see real outcomes from that project, and not just things that are directly based on our intervention and working with the ranchers, but the whole system starting to come back and feel itself is really empowering.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. I love the real world regeneration of the land and how that's restoring ecosystems.
That fox is actually my Expensify account logo. It speaks to me enough that I've made it my in-house brand within the company.
Wonderful. I'll have to look that up. Thank you for sharing. Felix, the next question is over to you. So you're actively deploying enhanced weathering projects in Latin America. And I believe even last week you did on-site visits to some of the in-planet projects in Brazil. Curious what you're seeing as the advantages of scaling enhanced weathering projects in the region.
Thanks for the question. I think we've been starting 3 years ago by doing first semester projects here in Brazil, because there was so much science indicating that enhanced rock weathering is most effective in Brazil, but there was no real active data, which is really proving that. We started really small to implement a couple of projects. Now we operate on more than 10,000 hectares by spreading rock wool together with farmers, trying to optimize the farming practices and also replacing fertilizers. I think site visits like we had last week is just demonstrating how fast we can go, especially here in Brazil. The weathering is very fast. I mean, we've been sweating now all quite a lot because of COVID. So I think the heat and the humidity and also the lot of rain we have here in Brazil is just fastening up the weathering. Why does this matter? To prove at the end that carbon removal is happening, and also to advance the science with a lot of data. And as faster the weathering is happening, as more data we do have, and as more information we also get at the end to optimize models and also the quantification of carbon removal as well. So I think for Latin America in general, I think the speed comes from humidity, but also comes from the soil, is one of the biggest advantages. And then there's also agriculture. I mean, if you look at Brazil, most of the CO2 emissions are coming from agriculture, coming from Europe or from the US. There are a lot of emissions coming from energy and also from the transport sector. Here in Brazil, it's agriculture. If you think about removing CO2, we're talking about enhanced crop putting, but if you think about avoiding CO2, especially in agriculture, CO2 is heavily coming from fertilizers, we imported. We can have at the end 2 targets achieved by doing one project. And maybe just one last comment to the site visits. We as a company believe in trust and transparency, so those site visits are always open for everyone, if it's academia, if it's other project developers. It was of course also impressed when we show what's happening on the ground, what we can achieve in such a short time, but also indicating what we still have to do when we have to collaborate as an industry.
Thank you so much for that perspective, and I think that is one of the most essential pieces, is bringing those projects to life and bringing people in to see what it actually looks like on the ground and how it can scale locally. So thank you for sharing that. Marianne, you're working with projects in the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage space, or what's commonly known as BECCS for those that work within the CDR space. Can you briefly explain for folks what BECCS is and why you're choosing to scale these projects in Latin America?
Nice, very nice. So thank you so much. Actually, I'd like to start with CCS. CCS is the carbon capture and storage. So BECCS is actually the CCS plus bioenergy. So you can combine the CCS with ethanol production, or for example, energy production with biomass. So what is important here in Brazil, because we have expertise in biomass energy also, but the main important here is the ethanol. We have the ethanol production that makes the CO2, the porosity of the CO2 in the ethanol production is very nice. We have a CO2 in the 98% of purity. So this is very, very important because it makes less cost to capture this CO2 and store it there. So that's very nice. So BECCS is this combination that take the CO2 for bioenergy and store that in the soil, for example.
Awesome. Thank you so much for breaking that down for folks. As you can see, there's a lot of different CDR pathways on stage today. It ranges across tech and nature, and there's so many different pathways that are already happening in the region. The next question is for you, Kyle. Mombag just secured a substantial deal with Google, so first off, congratulations to you and the team for that. I'd be curious to dig into what financing approaches have done the most for scaling carbon dioxide removal in the region, both in attracting investment and reducing risk.
Well, thank you for the invite. Thanks for the conference. Actually, I need to highlight Teradata as well as now a major provider of credits to Google.
Congratulations.
So, yes, I think we'll lean into your initial suggestion, Sasha, that CDR, at least in many of its forms, is moving from startup to scale, right? I think, Mombag, for example, we have now more than $200 million worth of contracted tons, including, a sizable contract with Microsoft, including being now Google's largest CDR provider and Google's first nature-based solutions provider. So, to our mind, there's no doubt that there's product market fit for what we do. There is, however, a problem of scale. Whether or not we can make a decent-sized business is not the question anymore. The question is, can we make it a big enough business quickly enough so that we really make a dent into climate change, right? That's the nature of the problem, is the scale. And I think finance, is a critical piece of that. And I see the way we've been developing in this market as a way of taking finance from a startup space to a scale-up space. So we've started as Mombag, as any other startup, with venture capital. So we've had something $50 million of venture money raised. That gets you to a certain distance, that allows you to innovate, that allows you to run some risks, but it won't allow you to plant many forests in our specific case, because that's a very expensive thing to do just with venture capital money. So then we sort of evolved into a next natural phase of our operation, which was securing equity funding in the form of a fund. So we have a fund in Brazil called the Amazon Reforestation Fund, or TARF. TARF has successfully raised something like $120 million just to do reforestation projects in Brazil, and we will have future funds coming up. But then again, that money is still equity. It's still, you still have investors who have a percentage of that business. You then need to figure out how to scale it more. And now I feel we are in the third phase of our story there, which is debt and unlocking cheap debt. I'm not talking about concessional capital, I'm talking about non-concessional capital, but I'm talking about where are the drivers of growth through incentivized debt. We have, for example, we are the first in Brazil of the BNDES's or development banks climate fund, which has very attractive debt. We were also beneficiaries of the first World Bank outcome bond that dealt with reforestation, and it's also the biggest outcome bond from the World Bank to date. So I believe the moment we are in this market is how do we make debt better? How do we risk adjust that debt? How do we explain and educate the markets on the real risk of carbon removal projects? Because I believe we still have a perception that carbon removal is really risky, and that makes that more expensive. So I think it's a natural progressive of assessing different pools, accessing different pools of capital for the different phases of employment.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that take. Julia, I also wanted to pass something to you on the finance side as well. What types of financing structures or partnerships have proven most effective in de-risking Teradot's projects and attracting buyers and investors? And I'm also curious if you're seeing investment mostly in the Latin American region or if that's coming from a global scale.
Yes, I think our story is actually quite similar to Momback's in the sense that today most of our financing has come from equity capital that understands deeply the scientific risk and some of the uncertainties associated with that. I think for us the next step is ultimately we're all building versions of new infrastructure, and if we're trying to move to infrastructure type capital, then we have to partner with the right people that know how to do that. And in enhanced rock weathering, I think we have an additional benefit where we already work with scaled infrastructure like sectors, like agriculture, like mining, that we can then plug into in a creative way so that we can get access to the capital as well. I think when we're talking about investors, Brazil versus outside, I can only speak for the Teradot case. Most of our investors have come from outside Brazil, with the exception of some of these structures, debt financing structures that are available to us in Brazil. I think a big reason for that is knowledge and understanding of some of these climate technologies, where a lot of the hubs of where this has come from have been hubs based in the US or in Europe. And so naturally a lot of these investors have been a little bit closer to that universe there than they have here. But we're slowly seeing that shift. So Kazakh is one of your investors, Brazil-based venture capital fund. We have Valor, who's also in Brazil, US cross-border. And so you're starting to see a shift in that, at least in the venture capital space.
That's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I also love the example that you brought in of integrating with existing industries. I think that's one of the fundamental pieces of carbon removal is how is it going to exist within the industries that are already there? How can it increase revenue across those industries? So very interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Mike, the next question is for you. So I mentioned before, and you've kind of seen during this conversation, that there are CDR solutions that are across many different pathways on stage today. Native and ASPN, you work across many of these pathways, and sometimes there's been a conversation in the industry or in the broader climate space of the difference between long and short-term duration of removals or nature versus tech, and kind of pitting those against each other when in reality they need to all exist and scale at once if we want to get to the scale that we need in order to limit global warming and climate change. So curious to hear your take on what you're hearing from investors of why they might be choosing one or what the different investment mechanisms might be with long and short-term durations.
Yeah, so So part of my job at Native is I manage the procurement side of the business as well. So out of our 250 or so clients that are invested or supporting one of our active projects, they come in, they either need a spot volume or they need a methodology or a type that's outside of what they've already supported with us. The two things that I hear the most from them that they want to see out of projects, first being proximity, second one being impact. On proximity, what I mean by that is they're looking for projects that are either close to their location or close to their supply chain, tapping into some of the resources that they need to do and conduct business. So as developers, what we need to be thinking of, who are our natural allies in our project, in our geolocation, or have already shown an interest in this. As we start to grow and scale as a sector, we're going to be able to bring in more of those natural allies, right, and get them introduced. And that's kind of like the gateway then to greater commitment, greater drivers for them to continue to support the industry. Now the second piece I said was on impact. What I often find is we are a bunch of nerds in our space, right? As soon as we sit down with a buyer, we want to talk to them about our nuances and the methodology, our registry of choice, but we don't realize we're often speaking a foreign language that CSO officer or whoever is sitting across the table from us. What we really need to do is synthesize down our project to make sure that we can clearly take off those carbon blinders and start talking about the impact beyond just carbon of project. I was talking about the ecological restoration of our project in Argentina that goes beyond just the soil organic carbon that we're storing in the soil. For us, when we talk about that project, we lead with the ranchers. We lead with that ecological restoration case. These communities are barely able to make it based on the margins that they're seeing in their industry being at one end of the supply chain. So when we can start to provide them the capital to not just restore their ecosystem, but really as a community of practice start to thrive in place, that's the kind of story that we need to be able to bring to buyers, not just the carbon story. The carbon story is so important, but what we realize is we're not building the tent. We're just talking amongst ourselves way too much when we talk about the carbon story to what we're doing as businesses and people in this sector. When we start to really simplify it and talk about the other drivers for action that we're seeing, the lives that we're touching, the ecological restoration work that's going on around it, we start to grow and build that tent. And to be honest, back to how I started, that's what they're asking for, right? So lean into what they're asking for and be ready to tell that story. And I think we'll all be able to continue to grow that pool of buyers. I had a chance last week to sit on a panel with Charlie Sellers from Microsoft. He does the sustainability for cloud-based services there. And it's not lost on them that there are 86 or whatever percent of the buyers working here. Yes, they are market leaders and it's very, very intentional. But guess what, guys? It's now a couple of years where they've been 86% of the buyer in the market, right? And so we're not doing enough to grow that pool. It's not just cost. It's not just carbon efficiency. Be able to tell the story about what the impact, be able to tell the story of who's your natural ally in developing your project in the first place.
Love it. So well said, and completely agree on the benefits and connecting with the communities that are kind of the end user of that project. So thank you for sharing that. Felix, on that same note, what incentives have been most successful to building long-term trust and engagement with communities in the projects that you develop?
I think I'm just building what also discussed. I think the question is the farmer impact, is the co-benefit or is the carbon movement also which is both? So what we see by investing a lot in the R&D and the science is that we can lead on the carbon movement side. So I'm not the market side of the carbon movement, which is the first important step. But if you look at the farmers, and if you want to long-term incentivize also the farmers, they need to be matured, aligned interest. So aligned interest in independent from any carbon movement credits, interest which the farmer has. I think if you look today at the crisis we're facing, the climate crisis might be one of the biggest we have, but also we're facing a super crisis. So much soil is being degraded, so many climate changes causing so much stress also for the crops, which is leading to a fluctuation of the yield and also the high prices on the foods in the food supply chain. And what's very exciting is that now after being a couple of years in the market, we see that we can produce on a constant basis higher yields for the farmers. And those higher yields are not coming from just simply adding more minerals and boosting the crops. It's really generating the soil. So we're producing over a couple of years a way more healthy soil, which is then of course also leading to more healthy crops, and then also at the end to a higher yield. We had a interesting panel on Monday about coffee, and there is already science out there that coffee also tastes better. So it's a win-win-win situation. You have a healthy crop, you secure a stable yield, which is a higher income for the farmer, you reduce the fertilizer, and on the other side, the products even taste better. And this is something we also have the ambition to lead on, to be that we ensure that farmer interest is fully in line with what we're doing as a business, somehow also disconnected to carbon removals.
I love it. That's really hard to argue with, honestly. I feel like from a farmer's perspective, if you have all of those additional benefits and it's also good for the climate, that is great to hear. So thank you for sharing that. Marianne, the next question is for you. What have been some of the main lessons learned in deploying best products in the region, whether around permitting or community engagement, feedstock availability, or the like?
So nice. We learned a lot with BEX project here in Brazil. Actually, we just have one, now two, but the first one is about FS. They have the first Global South project located in Mato Grosso. Kind of here is Lucas do Rio Verde, and we are helping them to develop this project. And what we learned with that, we learned how important it is to know the biomass source. So this is very, very important because here in Brazil we have a deforestation, so it's necessary to track this biomass to know where it's from and how to use that too. So that's very important because we need to follow our code, our forest code. What else? We have learned about the geological storage situation because we know we have big bases here in Brazil, but we still need to learn more because we just know we have a lot of bases to store the CO2. But we still need to learn more how much is the capacity of each basin here. So this is the next lessons to be learned. And what else? Let me check. We have learned a lot also from the oil and gas sector. They are very important for this sector here in Brazil because they know how to do that, and they need to pass that to give us the expertise about stored CO2, and we can improve and make that for the CCS project. So this partnership is very, very important to develop the CCS regenerative in Brazil. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you for that perspective. Kyle, the next question is for you. Being at COP30 specifically, where national policies are being shaped, I'm curious to hear what outcomes from COP could be most helpful for advancing renewables in Latin America.
Yes, great. Well, we're calling this the implementation COP, right? So at the COP level, I guess we want to see results and the first results coming in from things that were previously negotiated. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of national policy making going on, either at COP or because of COP or around COP or related to COP. I guess I've been discussing this in different panels. There's 100 things to say. But if I had to pick one topic, which I think maybe doesn't apply to all of Latin America, but certainly does apply to a part of Latin America, and certainly does apply to Brazil. What I would like to see is a more concerted effort, a more strategic effort to integrate Brazil into the international carbon markets. As has been mentioned, in the voluntary market we have very few buyers willing to buy very expensive high-tenure credits. We need to at some point plug our solutions into the broader net of international compliance markets and Article 6.4 packaging, all these things. The thing is, Brazil specifically, and there are countries in Latin America that have taken other views and that are more, let's say, aggressive on that part. Brazil specifically has simultaneously taken two views that, however technically correct they may seem, end up making us miss a lot of opportunities. The first view is that Brazil will only grant corresponding adjustments once it has 100% certainty of NDC compliance. That is noble to some extent because you are saying to the world, I'm not going to be putting anything out there unless I absolutely control my own NDC. But you don't see all that many countries taking that same view. But Brazil, on parallel with that, has also taken a very, again, noble decision, but to have a very, very ambitious NDC, much more ambitious than most countries. So when you see some countries with ambitious NDCs, and you see some countries saying they will grant corresponding adjustments until they are fully compliant, but you very seldom see countries taking both views at the same time. And in the end, what we may end up with is missing an opportunity which is capitalizing on Brazil's and in some other cases Latin American generals potential for being a net exporter of NDCs, a net exporter of carbon removals, and actually using that money that comes in, that revenue that comes in from very expensive, high quality removal that we can do here, to then funnel it into other sources of getting your NDC there, other strategies for achieving your NDC that are cheaper and can be leveraged by this, I guess, a little bit more aggressive entrepreneurial approach to the integration of your own carbon removal into the broader international state.
Sasha, not to break your flow, but I have just one added thought on this. Guys, I control F carbon removal on NDCs before this COP. How many NDCs do you think has a call out for carbon removal in their NDC?
I love you taking this over.
Zero. Not a single NDC calls out carbon removal. We absolutely need to be in the pavilion having these conversations, but we need to get over to the meeting rooms, over to talking with the delegates, and using that clout. Talk to them about these big investments that are coming into their country. We need letter of authorizations, and we need clear pathways for CDR to be a part of their NDC.
Thank you so much for both background information and the command F search. Thank you. And completely agreed. Julia, I will hand it over to you from here. From your perspective, what policy or regulatory changes would most help strengthen market confidence in carbon removal in Latin America, particularly for newer approaches like enhanced weathering?
Yeah, it's a great question, and maybe I'll use it as an opportunity to pick up on something that Felix was talking about why Brazil. So at Teradop, we work a lot with Embrapa. Embrapa, for those of you that are not Brazilians, I always joke it's a baby between NASA and the USDA because it's kind of like the most sophisticated research.
I don't think it's coming from you. I feel like it's background.
Okay. Most sophisticated research agency that you can imagine, and obviously a lot of leadership.
Try to turn it off. No?
Hello?
Julia, try turning it off. No? Because it's coming from here, right?
I think it might be someone else. Oh, beautiful. Thank you for the patience.
So we work with Embrapa, and Embrapa has an incredible story, which I think links with why often we think about, okay, why Latin America and obviously natural capital, the Amazon, all of those things. From our perspective, the kind of most advanced agricultural research happens here, right? And Embrapa is very interesting. One of the conversations with us, they said, look, the thing you're trying to do, we've already done it. We did it in the 70s, where we transformed Brazil from an agricultural importer to an agricultural exporter. And we used rock dust. It just happened to be a different kind of rock dust, limestone. And today, 25-27% of Brazil's GDP, depending on what number you're looking at, is agriculture. And that came from spreading a lot of rock dust. And why does that matter, right? To the question on policy, I think often I find we're operating in a space as if we're really working on niche solutions or things that aren't actually going to scale. But what if it does? And what if it transforms the story in the same way that limestone did for Brazilian agriculture in the 1970s? And then the questions we have to ask ourselves are actually very different questions, right? Because if you're using the analogy from global export commodity markets and trying to apply it to carbon removal, then the ask, and to your question about the policy change, is Article 6, 100%. I think we need to figure out how that's going to be managed. But then also, regulated markets on carbon removal around the world need to be very consistent so that we can actually have dialogue between markets, right? Because enhanced rock weathering works exceptionally well in Brazil, low cost, high scale. It might not work the same in Poland, right? And so how do you actually think about combining these things in a meaningful way? So my answer to that question, I think, is consistency across markets, inclusion of all the pathways. We're all set here. It's not about one pathway. We need all of them. And then have mechanisms like Article 6 that can mean that this new commodity, even though I don't like calling it that, can be traded.
That was a very insightful answer. Thank you for that. One question kind of going off of that, do you view any policies in place as doing it well, or any markets that are doing it well that can be replicated or should be scaled in some way?
I think doing it well is hard to measure because we don't have the outcomes yet, right? So I believe intention is there. We at Teradoc, we look a lot at the UK market, the Japanese market, the Singaporean market as markets that are truly trying to advance how to put removals into the national plans in a meaningful way. Probably if you did a control F, you would find 3 mentions instead of 0. So I think that's very helpful, but it's not enough for countries to just be doing it on their own because these solutions are global. They're localized in some ways, but they're global mostly.
Completely agree. Thank you for sharing that. Before we move into audience Q&A, I will ask the panelists one question that everyone gets the same question. And I'll start down at that side with Felix. But what would you like to see happen with carbon removal in Latin America? How would you like to see it develop in the next 5 to 10 years in this region? And what does that look like regionally, and how does it impact or integrate with the global scale?
It's a very, very great question. I think the exciting part is that looking at this panel here, the energy and also solutions which are represented, that we know everything is here. So we don't have to develop a new breakthrough technology to get to power the carbon removal into. On the other side, I think it's still small and it needs to develop further. So investing and also focusing on collaboration to drive the overall market further, that's on the policy side, making sure we speak in one language and speaking on the same topics about what's going to matter to move on the needle will be super important. And in 10 years, we're looking back, I hope we can see an industry which had a strong collaboration approach, supporting each other, moving overall the market ahead, instead of going into really competition on single solutions. I think how the different solutions will look like will vary on the regions. Brazil might be ideal for many nature-based, especially agriculture solutions, and then other regions might be others. So I think this will be something which will be dependent.
Thank you for sharing that. Completely agree, both with the collaboration piece and the regional differences. Now it might look completely different in one area than it might in the other, both in terms of regulation, but also in terms of what pathways are actually going to be most successful there. So awesome to have you all on site today to chat through what you're working on. Marianne, I will pass it over to you from here.
Okay. For CTR, would like to see a very strong demand for this type of project, especially for bags, because we have this knowledge, this type of project, but we don't see too much this demand of this type of project bags. Talking about the regulation, Brazil, we need to improve our regulation about storage, because we do have these laws since last year, but it's not complete. We need to improve that to show our regulation, but we don't need to create from zero. We can improve what is happening for example, in the United States or in Europe, we have good practice to be used here too. And also about the geological part, we need to improve that in the next years. We need to find what the layers are doing there, what layer could receive this CO2 to be stored in a safety manner. And that's it. About CCS, developing the CCS part, because the bioenergy is already developed.
Thank you for sharing that. So demand, storage, regulation, and geological needs. Thank you so much. Mike, I will pass it to you from here for the same question. And also, if you want me to repeat the question, because it's about
I'm jumping into the to answer, Sasha.
Oh, beautiful.
So the folks here who've dealt with me in the past or know me from this work, this is, I think, my 9th or 10th call. I started coming to these things during the CDM era, pre-Paris Agreement as a college student. And it's still good to see here, and they're still following a lot of the conversations around Article 6. When they were crafting Article 6, an ill-intended thing happened. They put all the attention on the country to create registries, to be able to grant the letter of authorization to go out and do that transfer of the ITMO, right? We all are starting to understand that. But what the countries did when they took that idea home and started to craft regulation around it, they're not just looking at letters of authorization and regulation for the ITMO, but starting to create regulation around the carbon industry happening domestically as well. That's really important for us to understand, because now you start to see the challenges that is going to look different in different countries. As a project developer, it becomes very difficult for us to scale investments at multiple countries at the same time. So what we really need to be working with, and what I hope we've accomplished in the coming years, is that we've started to harmonize those regulations across different countries. Because if you have registries or standards at a domestic level that are in bordering countries that don't line up with the third-party standard, whether that be isometric, Vera, gold standard, or whatever you're using, being cost as project developers, then that's going to bear on us to go through the additional audits and have multiple timelines working at the same time against us. It's really going to start to impact the ability to scale the project and grow the project. We want to bring in buyers. Right now, a lot of us are just working in a pilot phase. We don't have the scale to be able to attract the finance, to be able to even attract the buyers, right? I think if we don't have the regulations sorted in a way that is concise and harmonious across multiple countries, we're also not going to be able to get the letters of authorization in these agreements, whether it's Microsoft or the Googles and the other, not able to get that letter of authorization 3, 4, or 5 down into the future. So to understand the implications for our project of these policies, I'd love to talk to people about that more. And really, what I hope we see and what we've accomplished is, as project developers, we continue to educate the countries on what are the real impacts of the regulatory frameworks that they're putting forward, and whether or not those are enabling regulatory frameworks, or if they're really going to be slowing us down. Like we've said up here several times, we have the technologies, we have the solutions. Really, now we just need the pathways and the support to build the sector.
Thank you so much for that, Div. Not to be on the spot, but in terms of like harmonizing regulation, similar to the question that I asked earlier, is there, I guess, a standard that you think, or a country regulation that you think is moving forward at the pace or the way that it should be? And I don't know, do you have ideas of how you should harmonize regulation?
Yeah, so if UNFCCC has put together technical assistant groups that are working as regional hubs to try and do that harmonization work, I think that that's really important. There's best practices already out there. There's countries on the board that are signing 6.2 offtake agreements. So looking to them, trying to make sure that you protect your sovereign domestic interests, but are also leaning hard into those best practices is going to be really important, so that we were able to scale the market as a whole, whether that's in Ghana, where we know very clearly what that regulatory structure, fee structure, timeline looks like, or if it's going to be in Argentina, where not to give Argentina, our host country, a bit of a hard time, but they needed to come up with a registry, and they just scraped all of their registry data, and it's an Excel file on the environmental ministry's website, right? So you have places that are really trying to understand the market and how they can enable the market, and then we're seeing people who are doing kind of the bare minimum, right? And so, like, how do we make sure that those regulations are the way that they're able to do that is to work with the project developers. And one really challenge of talking to people abroad to attract finance into their country. They're not as good as talking to domestic project developers. Sometimes they don't even want to talk to project developers. So the hint and the idea I have is let's talk with our buyers. Bring our buyers from prominently from the global north to help make the case of why you need to see that clear timelines, those clear regulation statutes, and making sure that they're harmonized across countries, because they're a lot more interested to learn, because that's really how they've been recognized. They want to bring external investment into the country. Here's a great way that you'll be able to do that.
Thank you for sharing that perspective on the spot. Appreciate it. Kyle, I'll repeat the question for you, but what is your ideal of what carbon removal looks like in Latin America in the next 5 to 10 years? And how does that look regionally, and also how does that impact the global sector?
Thanks, Sasha. So I sort of unintentionally already begun to answer that question, right? I think the first thing that I would say is I would like to see LATAM carbon removal better integrated into the world markets, international markets, voluntary and compliance. But to add a second element to this, I think I would really like to see in 5 to 10 years that we, looking back, we'll say something like along the lines of the carbon removal industry not only thrived, but also helped us thrive. Right? I would like to see that we were able to integrate the opportunities that carbon removal produces, and LATAM is the place to do carbon removal, as we've been talking about, and integrate that with national strategies for social and economic development. We've just had so many wasted cycles of brief booms and opportunities that were lost for LATAM, certainly Brazil specifically. And I just feel like we have a really good shot at making truly sustainable development that creates thriving economies, thriving industries, and also thriving peoples. So I'm hoping 5 to 10 years to see something of that, or evidence of that.
I love that. I jot it down. CDR industry thrived, but also helped us thrive, and that will definitely be used to incorporate later on, so appreciate that. Julia, you as the closer, what does the CDR space look like in 5 to 10 years in Latin America?
So we're manifesting. This is a manifestation.
Through manifestations.
Okay. Yes, everyone, close your eyes, put your hand up. I would like to see Latin America as the global gold standard. I think we have all the ingredients, right? So in Brazil, 93% renewable grid. Chile, incredibly renewable grid. All the natural resources, both from natural capital all the way to mineral resources that you need for a lot of mineralization pathways. I would like to see LATAM as the gold standard of being able to pull in multiple versions of this carbon removal pathways. Bioenergy is another one, right? Forgot to mention. Where 10 years from now, we're looking at the economies here in the region, and we've done something similar to what we did with the agricultural revolution 50 years ago. So maybe it's not 20% of GDP, but maybe we're getting to 5. I think that would be amazing. And I think related to that, and then perhaps more on a personal note, I think there's something around, we're here in Brazil, right here in Berlin, and I think as a Brazilian, there's always something that I think we wait a little bit for others to show us the way. And I think this is specifically a topic where we can lead the way. So I'll close there.
Wonderful closing thoughts. Thank you so much. Before I kick it over to audience Q&As, just seeing if anyone else on the panel has any final words that they want to share. And if the answer is no, that's also clear. Nope. Okay, beautiful. I will turn it over to the audience for any Q&As. Does anyone, we'd love a quick hand raise.
Hi, this is Nasir from the Carbon Renewable India Alliance. So whatever advantages we talked about applies to the other big countries, particularly India or large countries which have similar conditions. So I have two big questions. What will help bring down the cost of CDR project? Because that is going to make Microsoft's market share come down to 90%. That's going to make the top 10 Brazilian companies or the top 10 Indian companies or whatever to also buy renewable credit. I think cost is a big barrier. So most industries, costs come down when scale happens, like we saw in mobile phones. But here are we in a chicken and egg situation where unless you have a lot of capital, you can't grow. Unless you grow, cost doesn't come down. So what would be the turning point? Is it some technological innovation? Is it something else? Both of you can answer that. And the second question was more on the role of blended finance. You talked about a lot of innovative, you talked about funds for Amazon and both markets, but can, what institutions like the World Bank, or let's say the Global Environment Fund, GEF, and others, provide the risk capital, let's say the first law of guarantee or whatever it is, because this is a risky business, this is a new business, and that can actually unlock a lot of commercial potential of when the private capital comes in when it is mature. So have you seen some good examples of blended finance opportunities in this CDR space?
I can start for financial governance. I think scaling only brings trust. I think financial reporting the challenges of scale, as you might scale complexity. We have a lot of operational puzzle pieces which have to fit at the end together. And I think understanding also here from a data perspective, how you can make this sometimes very complex operations very simple. How you can also bring some of the supply chain to specialists and don't do everything yourself. You might have to start as a project developer to understand the full supply chain, and then you can start leveraging the markets. So I think breaking down the complexity to something really simple is for enhanced workload is specifically very important to get to this. The beauty is, I think, for enhanced workload doesn't all big CapEx. Land is there, a lot of parties are there. With at the moment working mainly with result. There are other feedstocks which might be also interesting in the future. So I think from a pure material perspective, it's a very fast and efficient way to scale the we as a company focusing also to get cost down uncertainties. So today we're claiming for way less carbon than we actually remove. We just issued another batch of credits, again under isometric, from the second year of the project life cycle. And we see we have a lot of uncertainties which we're discounting today from the carbon claims, because of course we don't want to pay for something that cannot prove scientifically yet. We don't want to have the next big greenwashing scandal. But on the other side, we also know there's a lot of potential to put this on top, and this will increase the efficiency of the carbon gap, and vice versa, increase the costs we have to charge for that. Maybe just one last thought. I think financing, the cost of financing, especially in Latin, is also one of the major cost drivers. So if you go for the classical debt interest rates of 50% or more, to get access here in Brazil for those projects is very, very expensive. And solving this issue by getting a global loan from the global house closely together to finance these projects, and this will be the third key aspect of driving costs down.
Talking about the first question in the next scenario, actually the most expensive part are the geological study and the engineering instruments. So this one, the first one about the geological one, if you have that, it's easier to implement more projects here. So this is very important to know this first part about the geological one that makes this less expensive.
Yeah, from the SOC perspective, two things that I've seen. First, our project in Montana is a little bit further ahead than our project in Argentina in its issue and SIN process. Project in Montana just got an A rating from B0. But what I think is really exciting about when we're doing multiple projects under the same methodology and being able to kind of scale and grow those together is you just become more mature and efficient as a company. And over time, that efficiency bears to lower the costs, right? The second piece that has made our projects be able to be efficient on cost from a buyer's perspective is that help build strategy. Finance makes things expensive. If you're able to get that catalytic capital upfront going into that project that's deployed into the project, you're actually driving more money into action and less money away from the project. When that money goes to pay back that project financing, that is money taken out of the hands of the community, right? So how do we talk with our buyers? How do we talk with corporates and say, hey, it's real great that you're looking to pledge and do these big purchases, but what's that catalytic capital going into our project up front is going to create a closer relationship between the end retiring agency or buyer and the project developer. But in that closeness, they also are a part of it, right? They're a part of almost a community, a club, if you will. But it's also going to create a better project, which is more money flowing into it and less money flowing away from the project to pay out finance. So that catalytic capital up front, and then just generally the maturity of the project developer as we continue to grow. But just to flip us all upside down a little bit, I'd also make sure that we keep in mind that is driving down the cost of carbon really the point? I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say no, actually increasing impact is the point. And yes, we will drive down the cost as we become more efficient as our projects move from pilot stage into the maturity of reality. But the social cost of carbon isn't $3.70 what the BCM is averaged to trade at, right? The social cost of carbon is actually much closer to the floor price of CDR industry. So how do we coach and bring businesses along to know that they need to be paying more for the carbon? That $3.70 isn't the reality of the cost of what the action that they're trying to take.
I think that ties really nicely to Felix's point as well around charging more per ton than is actually necessarily being removed so that it doesn't come across as greenwashing or not meeting those goals in the end. We need to increase the impact. It might partially be about dropping down the cost so that it increases investors, but at the end of the day, it's about increasing impact and making sure that we're actually able to deliver on what we say we are. So really love this praise thing. Tyler, I'll turn it to you if you. Do you both have other?
I can maybe give a brief answer just to the blended finance aspect of the question. If you could have been a fly on the wall of any of the meetings I've had with the Brazil Development Bank in the last, I don't know how many months, that'll be the issue we would be discussing, right? You see me talking about how their lines of financing for forest restoration are amazing, 2% a year or something like that, and how not that amazing they get after factoring the fact that they need us to post bank guarantees. When it goes to the private bank, those guarantees immediately increase your overall cost from 2% a year to 8, 9, 10, or whatever. And then still, it's cheap finance, but it's not as cheap finance as you thought it was going to be or as it should be, right? So one thing that blended finance could do is first loss guarantee. We are now, with the help of BNDES and other international players such as the IDB, discussing ways in which we can bring, a little bit of concessional capital, but also capital that allows for some portion of risk and that is in some way catalytic in order to cover that, to just basically leverage all of this money that already is available at, for example, 2-3% a year. I think that's one game. And I think leading into other things that we were discussing, which is basically making us look more like an infrastructure sector than anything, as Julie was saying. At some point, we're going to have to convince financiers to do project finance for this, right? At some point, my Google and Microsoft offtakes will have to be seen as good enough to be collateral for sizable debt deals. We already have some of that, but we have nowhere near enough of that in the market right now. And I think a lot of that is just educating the market on what the risk really is, because I feel, again, because of some bad precedents that we've had in carbon markets, people still have a unbalanced view of how much risk there really is in a good project.
Thank you for that perspective, and thank you also for the thoughtful question on financing. I will hand the microphone over to this gentleman.
Thank you, Sasha. Tal from Carbon Blue. Mike, I have a question from you, but I think that's anybody relevant. Also, Moma, because to what you said now with the risk or buyers that are kind of limited. So as a project developer, I'm very interested to understand your perspective of first of a kind projects, technological or process-wise, and what do you need to see in order to adopt another technology, another process for a project anywhere in the world, as the, let's say, signals that diversify it. We were very interested in that as a CDR company with a breakthrough technology.
So, great question. And for us, we've been in that seat when we were registering SOC projects on Vera. Until very recently, we were the only people with issue tons, let alone registered projects, right? So we've been that out in front trying to charge into the sector. And a lot of times, the methodologies were imperfect, right? We're kind of taking it, using it as a platform and building upon it to strengthen it. That information went back to strengthen the methodology. But what I think what we had when we were the developers charging into these new sectors is we had a background of developing projects in the past. We knew what it took to be able to get things across the goal line. And so when I'm working or looking at new projects, CDR startups, I sit on the Air Miners Buyers Club and these different groups sitting in front of very early stage companies, really understanding their maturity and thought process for how they're going to tackle the process of actually generating the asset is something that trips them up every single time, right? I think we do focus a lot on our technology side of the business, and that's absolutely important. I see this on the CDR jobs board, right? Where it's all engineering positions, almost on that. But we don't lean in hard enough to make sure that we have people that are understanding the carbon side of the business and what it actually takes to deliver on those tons. I find that that's often really discounted. And then I run into project developers who are working with Vera, and they tell me, oh, we're a few months away from issuance. And I say, well, what's your solutions and how did your first findings go with Vera came back to you? And they don't quite know how to answer the question because they haven't gotten to that point. And they don't have anybody within their project team that's gotten to that point yet, right? So don't discount having the people within your squad, within your team that have actually delivered on projects, because all of the engineering and science knowledge is only going to be able to get you so far when you're sitting working with your VPB and sitting and working with the registry.
I like this dive. That's unfortunate, but I suppose better timing because it's towards the end. But thank you for that passion take. I feel like you were as invested in that as you are for the NDCs and Article 6, so I very much appreciate that. Exactly. I will pass it over to another audience member who I saw stand up earlier.
Thank you so much. I'm Jonathan from Terra, by the way, Argentinian. The question is for the entire panel, but particularly for Mike. I really like the idea to show impact to buyers from co-benefits. And I imagine that if you want to show that in Patagonia and your grassland, you should measure the growth rate of foxes. I don't work with foxes, but I would do that. I would put that in an example from agriculture, which is what I'm doing. So, how you can do that when you don't have an actual methodology or protocol to quantify the delta of the co-benefit that you can generate? And just, I will give an example. When you put a crop in a soil with some environment, you can have a gain, you can be neutral, or maybe you can be negative in crop yield. But that crop yield is a trait that is a function of more than 100 factors. So how you can show that?
Yeah, so we use Miro board for walking our process through when we're looking at the methodology and our project implementation. And I'll tell you, it's amazing. You scroll out, you can't read a single word because the Miro board boxes are so small when you look at them all together. Right? There's so much input is the point, what's going into our projects. How do we start to calculate and grab that? goes back to something I was saying earlier, though. Remember that the methodologies and the standards that we're using are really just the platform. We need to create things that are going to be able to make the narrative, make the case that go beyond that, and being able to communicate it. And don't be limited by the methodology or the registry that you're using. Find ways to continue to calculate and capture that impact. I say to the team when we go on project visits, I'm like, literally, like, don't put your cell phone down. I want you to take a picture of like every single thing that you see, because impact is also a lot of different things to different people, and the carbon team is looking at this in one perspective and view. But if we're able to sit and be like, wait a second, like, tell me more about this farmer, tell me more about their relationship, their generations with the land. Yeah, sure, we saw this amount of carbon sequestration over the last 5 years of our project at their ranch. But the real story there is the 6 generations of ranchers that have worked there before, and the team didn't know that. And so the way, or wasn't communicating that as like the impact. So finding the data that helps us tell the story, and then being able to go and look at your methodology as just a platform and building upon it. So that way you are actually going above and beyond what's out there. And let's be honest, like, we see there's a wide variety now in project integrity across the same methodologies, right? And a lot of it comes down to how people are able to track the various meaningful data inputs into their project and communicate that out. So keep going, I guess would be my advice. And if you think that there's a data point on the board that's really important, that story needs to be told, knock down the 4 walls around it and find out what are the data points that connect into it and start to create that story.
Thank you so much for that take. I love the storytelling element of it. The foxes, the ranchers, etc. Does anyone else, before we move on to the next audience question, have any further comments that they want to make to that one? Beautiful. I will hand the microphone.
Hi, what does free, prior, and informed consent look like, especially when you're doing these projects on Indigenous land, especially in Latin America?
Yeah, great question. So our projects in Argentina are on private property. Our projects in Kenya are working on conservation lands and with the tribal communities, the pastoralist communities that are rooted there. We did something that's actually quite interesting, is that we continue to do our ethic process, our interviews, sitting down with the community leaders. Mind you, there's about 70,000 people that live in that project envelope. Continuously going back and doing that ethic process is something that isn't really done a lot in the industry, but something that we need to lean into. Because guess what? People move around. People come and go. Making sure that you don't just do your ethic process at the start of a project, but continue to go back and do that education, that awareness, communicating that impact of their actions to them. It's going to bring you tighter to that community because you're getting feedback from them at the same time about what works, what they want to see change, what they want to see different. We're really tied in that we actually also have revenue. We do our help build payments go directly to the communities up front to invest in that infrastructure and build that project. Once that infrastructure is built, then we do a profit sharing agreement with the community for the issue tons or vintage tons going forward. That ethic process in that community has made our targeted investments and that capital pool share actually go a lot smoother. They have the ability to renegotiate that every interim, I believe it's 5 years, project dependent, but making sure that we continue to have that open line of communication. It can't just be at the start of the project. It has to be something that's a practice of the project ongoing.
Thank you for your insights on that. Are there others on the panel that would like to share how they work on projects in the region? Okay, great. Are there any other, and thank you for the thoughtful question as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Does anyone else have any further audience questions that we can pass along to our panelists?
How are you actually looking into the you hear me now? Yeah, okay. How are you actually liaising with those investors from the global north who have a different perspective from the global south now when it comes to funding? Because I work with the project developers, and the pricing discovery is always a challenge, you know, I mean, what you set and what they want, and, you know, the challenges in between. So what have been your experiences? I mean, you could just be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry for the microphone cutting off. I think we're down to maybe 2 or 3 now. Are there any folks on the panel that would be able to take that one?
So what kind of experience and advice we have for investors coming from the global north, investing in the global south? Is this correct? I think in the end it comes down to trust. And for many investors, I think it's always an equation: how much risk do you take and how much return do you get? And I think what we saw is that many climate and ag-tech investors coming from Europe, they see that there's a huge potential in Brazil. So there might be a higher risk perception on the country level, but there's on the other side, there's a very big return potential. I think if you bring this in one equation, Brazil and also the global south makes a lot of sense, especially for carbon removal.
Thank you for that too, Felix. Mike, do you have thoughts to add on that, or Ryan?
Yeah, maybe just a quick thought on what I've seen with our projects that's been quite successful in that first bringing your buyers down to the project. That was stated earlier. I can't understate the importance of that. I think that that's really amazing because it changes that dynamic of what you're talking about, the impact and value of the project. But another thing that has been really key for us, especially with our project in Kenya, so the revenue coming back from the project is overseen by the community as a carbon council that sits and kind of manages that work within the community. We actually, for every quarterly meeting we have for them, we actually put together a slide of what's going on globally in the market and why projects are able to generate extra revenue, how we're able to get pricing up. In the SOC space, you see everywhere from $120 down to, I think there's a Chinese regenerative grazing project that's $575 right now on CTX. And so being able to talk to the community about what drives value into the project, I love seeing how energized and hearing how committed they become, being like, oh, okay, like they're obviously not reading, you know, salamander and broker sheets every single day and doing due diligence on projects and understanding what's driving value. So communicating that back to the community is another great way to continue to drive their engagement, as well as transparency, as well as then you're going back with a very tight, informed package to your buyer.
Thank you for that context. Appreciate it. Does anyone else have any questions from the audience before we wrap? I think we can take 1 or 2.
Thank you for letting me ask another question. I'm wondering if anybody has like a values or a moral filter when deciding what investors to make business agreements with, like ensuring that you're not continuing to allow a fossil fuel industry to continue polluting, or similar industries to continue contributing to the climate crisis that we're currently in.
Thank you for the question. Felix, you look ready to answer?
It's a tricky one. I think it's also here, as with farmers and also partners in supply chain, aligning interests I think is very important. Aligning interests I think is very important. And many funds, they have the fungible thesis, like investors, they have the fungible thesis, so why and how they deploy capital, public or even at least abstract. And also, many investors have impact metrics in place to measure at the end the impact that capital is producing, which I think is a great indicator. If it comes to fossil fuel and oil and gas, I think this is a very tricky question. So far, we don't have a fossil. We don't have a fossil fuel company in the cap table, don't pretend to have this. But on the other side, there's also people, and I think it's a fair argument to say you need to make them part of the solution. And part of the solution is, of course, not to kind of use carbon removal at the end to even emit more CO2 with the production they're doing. But on the other side, getting them on the same side and getting them aligned in reduction and also potential for the future is something which is very, very important. So I think it's a conversation that needs to happen at least. In this conversation, everyone should be involved, but be really careful about the metrics investors measuring their return on investment. If it's only profit, I think it's quite challenging for impact-driven companies. If the impact metrics in place, I think it's a strong indicator this might be great investment. We as a company, we do this a lot.
I feel like this is the universe cutting us off. We are down to one mic. We'll see if it continues. But thank you for the thoughtful answer, Felix. Does anyone else have any final audience questions before we close it out? Or before this mic decides to wander off?
Just to answer your question, we have a stated no oil and gas, no arms, no tobacco.
Thank you. Projected as I know that you can. Any final thoughts from the audience or panelists? Okay, well with that, thank you all so much for joining the session today. It was such an interesting conversation to have you on stage. Thank you for chatting through the projects that are happening in Latin America. I think particularly being in Brazil today and having the COP here and being able to dig in very concretely to how these projects are developing, how they're affecting local communities is incredibly impactful. So thank you all so much for taking the time to chat today, and thank you all so much for taking the time to listen.